I've always believed that nothing good ever happens after midnight. Maybe it's just something my grandmother used to say, a warning passed down through generations. But the older I get, the more I realize how right she was. In a small town like mine, where the nights are so quiet you can hear the wind brushing against the old maple trees, you start to notice things that city folks might miss. The way the darkness seems to press in a little closer after midnight. The way the silence feels heavier, almost expectant. I never thought much of it. Not really. Not until the night I learned, in the most unforgettable way, why you should never answer the door after midnight. It was late October, the kind of night where the cold seeps into your bones and the fog rolls in thick from the river, swallowing up the street lights and turning familiar roads into shadowy corridors. I was home alone, my wife and kids away visiting her parents for the weekend. I'd spent the evening watching old horror movies, half laughing at the jump scares, half wishing I'd chosen something lighter. By the time I turned off the TV, it was well past midnight. The house felt emptier than usual, every creak and groan of the old floorboards amplified by the silence. I was just about to head upstairs when I heard it, a knock at the front door. Not a polite tap, but a slow, deliberate pounding. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, echoing through the hallway. I froze, my hand halfway to the light switch. Who would be knocking at this hour? I glanced at the clock on the wall, 12:41 a.m. My first thought was that maybe it was a neighbor, someone in trouble, maybe a car broken down or an emergency. But as I stood there listening, something about the knock unsettled me. It wasn't frantic or desperate. It was patient, almost rehearsed. I crept to the window beside the door, careful not to make a sound. The porch light was on, casting a pale circle onto the front steps, but the fog was so thick I could barely see past the railing. I squinted, trying to make out a shape, a face, anything. But there was nothing. Just the empty porch, the swirling mist, and the echo of those 3 knocks still ringing in my ears. I waited, heart pounding, expecting another knock. Instead, there was silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, debating whether to open the door, to call out, to do anything at all. My mind raced through every possibility. Maybe it was a prank, maybe someone needed help, maybe it was nothing. But deep down I felt a cold certainty settle in my gut. Something was wrong. I backed away from the door, every instinct screaming at me to leave it locked and walk away. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and fear, even more so, can make you do strange things. I found myself reaching for my phone, my thumb hovering over the screen as I debated whether to call the police. What would I even say? Someone knocked on my door and now there's nothing there? It sounded ridiculous even to me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from just beyond the edge of the porch light, hidden in the fog. I tried to peer through the peephole, but the glass was fogged up from the cold outside and the warmth inside. All I could see was a distorted blur. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear any sound, a footstep, a whisper, anything. But there was only silence, thick and suffocating. I told myself it was probably just a kid playing a prank, maybe one of the teenagers from down the street. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. The knock had been too deliberate, too heavy. Not the kind of knock a kid would make. I stood there paralyzed for several minutes, My mind kept replaying the sound of those knocks, the way they seemed to vibrate through the wood and into my bones. I tried to remember if I'd locked the back door, if the windows were all shut. I moved quietly through the house, checking each lock, each window, making sure everything was secure. The house felt colder now, the shadows deeper. Every time I passed a window, I felt the urge to look out, to see if someone or something was standing just out of sight. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Eventually, I returned to the living room and sat on the edge of the couch, phone in hand, staring at the front door. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I'd laugh about this in the morning. But the minutes dragged by, and the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I tried to distract myself, scrolling through my phone, but I couldn't focus on anything. My eyes kept drifting back to the door, half expecting to see the handle turn to hear another knock. Then, just as I was starting to convince myself it was over, that whoever or whatever had been there was gone, I heard it again. 3 knocks. Slower this time, heavier. The sound seemed to reverberate through the entire house, rattling the picture frames on the wall. I jumped to my feet, heart hammering in my chest. This time I didn't go to the door. I didn't even move. I just stood there, rooted to the spot, listening as the silence returned, even more oppressive than before. I tried to steady my breathing, forcing myself to think rationally. Maybe it was someone who needed help, I reasoned. Maybe they were lost, or their car had broken down on the road outside town. But if that were true, why wouldn't they call out? Why wouldn't they show themselves in the porch light? The questions circled in my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. I thought about calling the police again, but something held me back. A strange, irrational fear that if I made a sound, if I acknowledged the presence at the door, it would somehow become more real. I glanced at the clock again. 12:56 a.m. The minutes seemed to crawl by, each one stretching out longer than the last. I sat back down, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. I tried to remember if I'd ever heard of anything like this happening before. Stories from my childhood came back to me, tales of strangers at the door, of things that walked the roads at night, of warnings to never let anyone in after midnight. I'd always dismissed them as superstitions, the kind of stories parents tell to keep their kids from wandering outside after dark. But now, sitting alone in my silent house, they didn't seem so far-fetched. The silence was broken by a sudden, sharp sound, a scraping like fingernails dragging across the wood of the door. I flinched, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound was slow, deliberate, moving from the top of the door to the bottom, then back up again. I stared at the door, willing myself not to move, not to make a sound. The scraping stopped as suddenly as it had started, replaced once again by that suffocating silence. I waited, barely daring to breathe. Minutes passed, or maybe it was only seconds. It was impossible to tell. Then, without warning, my phone vibrated in my hand, the sudden noise making me jump. I looked down, expecting to see a message from my wife, maybe a news alert, anything normal. But the screen was blank. No missed calls, no messages, nothing. I stared at it, confused, until I realized the vibration hadn't come from my phone at all. It had come from the floor beneath my feet, a low, rumbling tremor, as if something heavy was moving beneath the house. I stood up, heart pounding, and listened. The vibration faded, replaced by a faint rhythmic tapping like footsteps on the basement stairs. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, the old pipes rattling in the cold. But I knew better. I could feel the footsteps, each one sending a jolt of fear through my body. They stopped, and for a moment there was nothing. Then, from the other side of the door, a voice whispered my name. At first, I thought I must have imagined it. The voice was so soft, so close. It was as if someone was standing right on the other side of the door, their lips almost pressed to the wood. My name, spoken in a tone that was both familiar and utterly wrong. It sounded like my wife, but I knew she was miles away, safe at her parents' house. The voice called again, a little louder this time, pleading, "Please let me in. It's so cold out here." My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I wanted to believe it was a trick, a recording, anything but what it sounded like. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. Every instinct told me not to answer, not to respond, not to give in to the fear that was clawing at my chest. I remembered the stories I'd heard as a kid, the warnings about things that could mimic the voices of loved ones, about spirits that wandered the night looking for a way in. I'd always laughed them off, but now, standing in my own living room, I wasn't laughing. The voice called again, more insistent this time. "Please, I need your help. Something's out here with me." The words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there and listen. But I couldn't move. It was as if the voice had rooted me to the spot, holding me in place with invisible hands. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, but the voice only grew louder, more desperate. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. I opened my eyes, half expecting to see the door swinging open, to see something standing in the doorway. But the door was still closed, the lock still in place. I forced myself to move, to back away from the door, to put as much distance between myself and whatever was outside as possible. I retreated to the kitchen, grabbing a flashlight from the drawer and clutching it like a weapon. I checked the back door again, making sure it was locked, then moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The fog was even thicker now, swirling around the yard, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, the sense of being watched, of something waiting just out of sight. I stayed there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting, barely daring to breathe. The house was silent, but the fear didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, pressing in on me from all sides. I knew with a certainty I couldn't explain that whatever was outside wasn't gone. It was still there, waiting, patient as the grave. I tried to distract myself, turning on the kitchen radio to fill the silence, but the static only made things worse. Every crackle and hiss sounded like footsteps. Every faint voice in the background made me jump. I paced the kitchen, flashlight in hand, glancing at the clock every few minutes. Time seemed to move differently, each second stretching out, the hands barely creeping forward. I kept telling myself that if I could just make it until morning, everything would be fine. The sun would rise, the fog would lift, and whatever was outside would be gone. But the night dragged on, and the sense of dread never left. I thought about calling someone, my wife, a friend, even the police, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. What would I say? That I was scared of a voice at the door, that I thought something was out there, something that sounded like my wife but wasn't. I knew how it would sound. I'd probably end up as the subject of small-town gossip, another story for the rumor mill. I tried to convince myself to go upstairs, to lock myself in the bedroom and wait it out. But every time I started toward the stairs, I felt a wave of panic, as if leaving the first floor would be a mistake. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I turned my back on the door, if I let my guard down for even a second, something terrible would happen. So I stayed in the kitchen, flashlight pointed at the hallway, waiting. At some point I must have dozed off because I woke with a start to the sound of another knock. This time it was softer, almost gentle, but somehow even more terrifying. I looked at the clock, 3:07 a.m. The knocks came again, 3 in a row, just like before. I stood up, my legs shaky, and crept toward the hallway. I could see the outline of the door in the dim light, the fog pressing against the glass like a living thing. Then as I watched, the doorknob began to turn. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it twisted back and forth, as if someone on the other side was testing the lock. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed, ready to run or fight or scream. But the door held, the lock stayed firm. After a few moments, the doorknob stopped moving and the silence returned. I backed away, heart pounding, and retreated to the kitchen once more. I sat at the table, flashlight in hand, staring at the hallway. I didn't move, didn't speak, barely even breathed. I just waited, counting the minutes until dawn, hoping against hope that the night would end and I would survive to see the morning. The hours between 3 and 5 in the morning are the loneliest I've ever known. I sat there shivering, every sense on high alert, listening for the slightest sound. The house seemed to settle around me, the old wood creaking and groaning as if it too was uneasy. I kept the flashlight trained on the hallway, refusing to let my guard down. Every so often I'd hear a faint noise, a tap at the window, a whisper of movement outside, but I told myself it was just the wind, just the fog brushing against the glass. Anything to keep from thinking about what might really be out there. At some point, I realized the sky outside was beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn filtering through the fog. The oppressive darkness started to lift, and with it, the suffocating sense of dread began to ease. I let out a shaky breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders start to melt away. I stood up, stretching my stiff limbs, and walked to the window. The yard was still shrouded in mist, but I could see the outline of the trees, the faint glow of the sun rising behind them. I felt a surge of relief, as if I'd survived some terrible ordeal. I made myself a cup of coffee, hands still trembling, and sat at the kitchen table staring out at the fog. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that whatever had been outside was gone with the night. But as I sipped my coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced at the front door, half expecting to see the doorknob turning again, but it was still, the lock firmly in place. When the sun was fully up and the fog began to thin, I finally worked up the courage to check the porch. I unlocked the door, hesitating for a moment before pulling it open. The cold morning air rushed in, and I stepped outside, scanning the yard for any sign of what had happened during the night. At first, everything looked normal. The porch was empty, the steps damp with dew, the street silent and still. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the doormat in the center of the faded welcome sign were 3 perfect muddy handprints. They were too large to be a child's, too slender to be a man's. They looked almost wrong, the fingers too long, the palms too narrow. I stared at them, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I knelt down, reaching out to touch one, but stopped myself at the last second. I didn't want to know if they were real.